we'll get right to our first session about evidence-based training and invite our panelists to the virtual stage. They're going to be joining us via audio right now. Stephen Poplawski, the director of STEP Training Incorporated, and Judith Anderson, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. The duo will be discussing a paradigm shift in police training with a focus on officers' internal processes, including the modulation of stress, cognition, and emotions. Backed by years of evidence-based research, techniques have been developed to assist in this process. So fasten your seatbelts as I pass the screen and mics over to Judith and Steve.
Hi, Renee. Thanks so much. We're thrilled to be here to talk about how we've integrated evidence-based programming into police training so far.
And yes, thank you. We appreciate you inviting us to this great event, and we look forward to discussing this topic with everybody.
So let's begin with an idea of, let's take a moment to think about what evidence-based training is. What distinguishes evidence from opinion? So evidence-based is becoming a very popular term, and it's being placed all over our police training materials and our reading and handouts and even our research articles and so forth. But what does it really mean to be evidence-based?
To help highlight this, I thought I'd bring up a topic which has been taught and been discussed at many colleges and at police organizations, which is the do we teach to passenger side approaches to vehicles, or do we teach to driver side approaches to vehicles? And today we're not going to take sides as to which one we believe to be more safe or better training. What we want to talk about is how would we then take those concepts, those training methods, and look at them from an evidence-based point of view. How do we move that past personal opinion of the trainer of the day and look at evidence-based ways to say that this method is the better way because of the evidence that we've collected in that. And in doing that, we want to look, we're trying to increase officer safety. We're trying to increase the officer's ability to see into the vehicle, road hazards. Those are some of the things that we're trying to address. We want to approach it from an evidence-based practice as to which way we want to choose.
So you probably came up with some of the following. So to call something evidence-based, we take a research approach. That's a component that's necessary. Now, research can be done in collaboration with experts in the field at a local, university or organization, or collaborations across the country or many countries, or it can be done in-house. For example, ENQP and the Training Institute in Quebec has an in-house research team, and I'm sure there's a lot of other police services that do this as well. So the point is really to conduct scientific research to understand what works systematically and most effectively at your service, at your location. So in order to do this, the first thing you want to outline is your study variables and create an operational definition. For example, if you are wanting to study the officer approach to increase safety outcomes, you want to define what you mean by safety. So you'd list out the variables you believe that would indicate that one was more safe than the other. Things like number of officer injuries, number of passenger injuries, number of accidents, and so forth. Then you can study officers trained in either approach and compare these variables to determine which approach attains your best outcome, like, for example, a reduction in the number of injuries. You could institute a training program that instructs your police officers on the safest approach and conduct follow-up assessments to determine if the training gains lasted over time and continued to be effective. If not, you could make those adjustments as needed. So repeat a critical analysis of what you found in the field routinely, for instance, every 3-6 months, or even longer, depending on your desired outcomes. So now we'll move on to discuss findings from our collaborative program of research.
So what we're going to talk about is a paradigm shift. And what we mean by that is we're talking about a fundamental shift in training. We want to change an approach that addresses new areas of instruction and education. We want to shift our attention to the officers themselves. So traditionally, police training has been focused primarily on learning to manage the external skills. When we talk about that paradigm shift, we're talking about trying to get at what the officer themselves are going through and what they're thinking in their decision process. So research in physiology, learning, and performance shows that if a trainee learns how to manage their own factors, their own physiology, they will in fact be able to pick up the skills better in the training of external skills. So when we talk about external factors, these external factors are extremely important, and they are driven, and officers are often, the training for officers is driven by this need to do external skill training. We teach officers how to apply skills in stressful situations, and that's the key of training, is to be able to not take those skills and apply them under stressful situations. So the external skill factors are extremely important, but what we're talking about is adding another component to that training.
The component that we've added is to look at internal factors. And so advancements in neuroscience and physiology in the last decade have made it clear that there's a dramatic impact of internal psychological and physiological stress responses on performance and decision making. And I encourage all of you to read the references that we have listed on our pages. They're in the superscript numbers. So you can see that these effects of the stress response system on behavior and decision making are even come down even to the cellular level. Furthermore, what's exciting is that there's been advances in technology that allow us to measure things like cardiovascular reactivity in the field. And our research group and many others now have actually measured police officers during training and active duty, and they've demonstrated this close communication between autonomic nervous system activity in the brain and decision-making and behavior. So what happens is that the skills and tactics learned, for example, like in de-escalation training, they're stored in these higher order brain areas, such as the prefrontal cortex. That's where thinking and learning and memory is stored. This stored knowledge can then either be accessed or blocked, depending on the communication between the brainstem and sympathetic reactivity. For example, if the sympathetic nervous system is highly activated without that stress regulatory process of parasympathetic, like dampening down. So, and it's normal to experience this high sympathetic nervous system reactivity and reduced parasympathetic function when encountering threat or stress. That's the default survival stress response. But what we do know is that that's not as adaptive to many of the demands required in policing. For example, both emotion regulation and situational awareness rely on higher order brain processes like thinking and decision making. Thus, we need to make sure that the autonomic nervous system and the brainstem processes do not block those higher order cognitive functions. The good news is that there are concrete, tangible, and rapid techniques to modulate these autonomic stress arousal processes, things that we thought couldn't be controlled before. And part of this is enhancing parasympathetic function during calls that doesn't take away from the ability to respond to the situational demands.
All right, so one of the terms that we use in the training that we offer is this concept of a U factor. And what we mean by that is, regardless of the tool or the skill you're trying to apply or use, you are the common factor. It all comes down to you. And there's a difference between knowing something and applying it. So knowing it on an intellectual level is one thing, but applying it brings about many other factors and challenges that you have to factor into the training right from the beginning. So to emphasize this point, I'm going to work through a particular issue that comes up quite often within the policing environment. So if an officer is being trained on a CAW or a taser, for someone that doesn't know that term, they're trained in all the various components of the taser, how it works, and they're also trained to the proper distance to deploy the taser so that you have the proper probe spread so that you get the proper lockout that you're looking for. And that is trained, and not only is it trained, it's also testable. It's embedded into various written tests that the officers do when they're doing that qualification. However, when we look at real life deployments of the CW, we often see deployments where they were deemed ineffective. And the reason why they're ineffective is the actual distance in the deployment was much less than what is required to get that proper probe spread. So the officers were trained to know that the ideal distance is a certain amount, but in the application piece of it, in a real life event, we're seeing applications or we're seeing officers trying to use that taser at a distance that is not going to be effective. So how do we account for this change? Because they were tested on it in training and they knew the right answer. And at some level, they were able to demonstrate it, even through reality-based training. In training, they were able to demonstrate it. But now we have a real life situation where they're not able to meet that demand or meet that skill. And what we're talking about here is the internal. It's the internal piece. In the training, we didn't factor in the internal physiological responses of the officer. And that's what the change is, and that's what's making that different and why the outcome is different in a real life event versus a training event. So when we deal with training, we have to address that piece because it is a major piece on outcomes.
It's important when we do our measurements to use objective measures. Objective standards and performance are needed to ensure knowledge, understanding, and ability to apply these skills. So example, subjective is something that is your opinion or what you're thinking about, but objective is an actual measurable variable. So for example, if checking with dispatch, back to our example that we gave at the beginning, if checking with dispatch is a standard procedure at your service, when an officer performs a vehicle stop, then an objective measure would be measuring the actual number of times they do check in with dispatch. So that would be an objective measure of performance. Now, in our case, if you wanted to know if stress was interfering with the number of times they called into dispatch, then you would need to measure an objective indicator of stress, something like cardiovascular reactivity, and see if that was associated or correlated with the mistakes in performance, not calling in when it was appropriate. So depending, relying on things just like subjective measures, well, I felt stressed, or I didn't, or I think that person looks stressed, that wouldn't give you this kind of scientific data that you would need to draw conclusions about whether your intervention or your training was effective or not. So we're going to give an example of a training program that we've developed based on thousands of hours of data collection, objective data collection, over hundreds of police officers in Europe and in North America. And we've conducted a number of different types of studies on this program, the IPREP training intervention, randomized controlled trials, longitudinal within subjects training, and correlational studies as well. And so from multiple different organizations, police in different areas in the world, we find similar results. So the IPREP training intervention really has two core components. One is the content of the program. So we cover, again, in more detail, brain and physiology. So officers can understand the performance implications of this stress physiology and kind of the human limitations of that, as well as how acute and long-term stress impacts both their health and resilience, in addition to performance. And we teach self-regulation skills through biofeedback, which is a modern way of using physiological equipment to get real-time, immediate feedback and to adapt and be able to modulate your stress responses so you can adapt to whatever the situational demands are. But of course, content is not everything. It's very important in the way that we deliver this content. So science is clear about the kind of the importance that the delivery of any training is science-based. So we integrate that into the facilitator interactions with the students, positive, concrete instructions, confidence building, and of course it matters. Research has something to say about the timing and type of feedback. Of course, this is all delivered through reality-based training and scenario design, and the way that we deliver our scaffolded training from easier to more complex, based on the principles of learning during stress. We turn to the science of that so we can really make sure that what people are learning is retained over the long term. And with these biofeedback monitors and with the ability to modulate your stress response, you can really conduct individualized learning in the group setting, because that's another criticism or concern that people have. We have so many people to put through new programming. How do we focus in on the individual needs, because each individual obviously does have their needs. But if they have their own training materials, the instructor can check in on an as needed basis. So just to briefly cover the results, and of course you can read up on our research articles, the IPREP intervention results, we have found that it is successful in modulating stress responses to meet situational demands. So by doing this biofeedback exercises, what you can, if you need to ramp up your stress response to meet the demands of an extremely intense situation, you can do that, or modulate it down, regulate it if you need to. We've found dramatic reductions in errors in lethal force and health improvements in the ability to recover from stress, because of course recovery is an extremely important variable, because without it you won't be able to also make decisions and maintain optimal occupational functioning. In our longitudinal studies, we also have seen that these training gains have lasted across the long term, between 6 and 18 months.
So we thought it might be useful just to talk about some actual people that we've been working with and applying some of these tools of IPREP too, and some of the success that they've had with it. So one of the agencies that we've worked a lot with is the United States Probation Service. And when you look at that organization, they deal with offenders normally in their home environments. That's quite common. So the officer has to drive to this person's home environment and deal with them. And they're normally on their own. They normally work independently. And sometimes they're in extremely remote areas. If you think of some of the areas like in Arizona, and there's some, you know, if you think about the United States, there's a lot of spots that are extremely remote. So what the officers were talking about was that they were feeling the stressors of that job requirement even before they got to the person's residence. It was starting to weigh in on them. And they were looking for ways to try to offset that. So in applying the tools of IPREP, they've had great success in giving officers tools and methods to try to reduce some of those stress responses, both before, during, and after their encounters with the offenders that they're dealing with. And they've had great success with that. Another piece that's come out of this was an area in the US that the chief was struggling because a lot of their officers were not passing the firearms portion of the qualifier immediately. And there was, you know, somewhere around a 25–30% failure rate on that initial testing. And when we talked about it and we started to apply the IPREP piece to it, we realized it wasn't the training, it wasn't even the skills themselves, it was the stress, the performance stress associated to going in and doing a firearms qualifier, which was hindering his staff. It was the performance needs. So when we applied the IPREP tools to that process, we found that it reduced that performance stress, it reduced that overall stress. And for the first time ever, they had 100% pass rate on their firearms qualifications, which we thought was quite awesome. So in addressing that internal processing, they actually had a better result with the external skill. We've also done a lot of work in Iceland with the Icelandic National Police. And for them, it's a little bit of a different twist. So for the Icelandic National Police, they've made a lot of changes in the way they train, a lot of changes in how they move training forward, and they've introduced things like reality-based training, and all of this is fairly new for them. Over the last decade, this type of stuff has been introduced to their training process. So when we talk about the IPREP success in Iceland, we're talking about the trainers using those tools to offset performance-related stress with their students. Because you have to imagine these officers have been going through training for many, many years, many of them, and they haven't been subjected to, say, reality-based training. That's a new thing. So what they were finding was, again, it was the performance stress that was creating problems in the training, not the actual skill sets of the officers. The officers knew what to do, but under the performance side of it, there was issues. So in introducing the IPREP model to their training college, they started to work with officers on the internal stress factors, and they were seeing much better results in the actual training, specifically with the reality-based training pieces. And we feel that that was a big success for them.
We've been working with Finland since 2014 to help them to integrate evidence-based practices into their National Police College. So this is a great example of how on a national level, policing can kind of be restructured to incorporate these training programs. And now IPREP is part of the core 3-year required curriculum at the Police University College. And the techniques are really integrated throughout the curriculum, and instructors are using IPREP techniques during reality-based training to reduce stress and really to allow for more positive learning experience for the recruits and expert trainers. So it's a really, really rewarding and a great example of how, as an entire country, they are dedicated to investing in evidence-based training. And of course, it's been challenging, and they've met a number of barriers, and the director and all the administrators and so forth have worked through this, the issues of instituting such systematic change. And IPREP is one example of programming that's been integrated into their restructured training. So it's really exciting to see that evidence-based training practices can really work, and they are working, around the world.
Yes.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And the resources page are here. So these are just some of the articles that we suggest. Of course, there's many others, and on the next page is our contact information. We're certainly happy to answer further questions.
We thank everybody for their attention. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Judith and Stephen. That certainly gave us a lot to think about in terms of training and knowledge versus application, and where we go from here if we are to progress forwards in a modern and, of course, science-backed way. So thank you. We do have a few questions for you to hear from the audience of listeners right now. So I'll start with number one. With limited training hours available, how would a police service integrate new training into their existing programs?
But when you add new training, obviously there's going to be a little bit of cost up front in terms of time. You're going to have to invest a little bit of time. But the thing that we're going to find, and the example I gave everybody with the firearms qualification isn't unique to that particular agency. Every police agency in Ontario and Canada has issues with performance anxiety, with people getting to their range and they're already highly stressed before they even get there to do the qualifier. So when we're talking about time, we want to invest quality time up front to make that process easier as we move forward. So if we can do things to reduce the stress of the officer in training and ultimately in the field, we're going to get better results. We're going to have better outcomes. We're going to get through training a little bit faster, a little bit easier. We know that once we get past the qualifying piece, that we can do some of the other types of training that we want to do. And it's going to, although we have to invest a little bit of time in training the trainers on how to provide that information to their staff, their people, their officers, once they get it, it's going to move everything forward, and you're going to end up with better results overall. And the other thing that IPREP, we didn't talk too much about it today yet, but the thing that IPREP offers is this idea, but we can learn how to do stress modulation. You're going to impact all areas that these officers are trained in, not just a use of force capacity. So I know that health and wellness is a major piece in any police organization right now, is the health and wellness of their people. Well, IPREP speaks to that, specifically the health and wellness of their people. Let's say you're a driver trainer, not a use of force trainer, you're a driver trainer. Well, the IPREP techniques are going to roll over to that piece. Maybe you're writing a test to write your sergeant's exam. Learning how to control your internal modulation and modulating your own stress levels is going to assist you in that process. So although there's a little bit of cost and time up front, once you get it, it's paid back tenfold, because you can apply it to almost every other area of training and performance throughout your career. I hope that. Yeah.
Extremely useful if we're extrapolating that way into all other different departments, right? Mm-hmm. All right, another question here. As police officers, if we know a practice works in the field, isn't that considered evidence-based?
So great question. Thank you for that. And we've heard that quite a bit. And absolutely, it may actually be. But until you, like I said, create an operational definition of what you mean, what you want to test, create a way to test that, and then actually collect some data about that so that you can show it's not just my opinion. No, this actually does keep officers more safe to approach from this side of the vehicle or not. Here are the hard facts. And this is going to save lives ultimately. And so it's true, what you believe might actually be the correct thing, but without having any concrete evidence, others can't evaluate that or assess that, right? And so if you've done that research, if you've assessed that, then other places, other departments, other services, even other countries can take that and also test that at their organization to see if that is also applicable to the officers or the safety principles there at their organization.
One thing, just to follow up on that, one thing that's I've learned from my own experiences in the last few years in working with academics and working with other professionals outside of policing is that it is important sometimes to bring in people from outside our own environment and look at what we're doing and weigh in on it. So to have an academic look at what we're doing and say, these are some of the reasons why I think it works, doesn't work, here's that's extremely valuable. Bringing in the medical community. If we're dealing with people in crisis and stuff, we got to bring in medical experts to complement and offset the expertise that we bring from the policing side. We've got to bring in the social workers on that. So I think that part of it in this terms of testing and ensuring that we are doing best practices, evidence-based practices, is allowing others to come into that process and also weigh in on it. So we get a really good comprehensive look at the topic that is, it's more than just from within the policing environment itself. It's not devaluing the policing piece, but that's just one piece, and we have to bring in other pieces to really get the best picture and the best response to the training needs of the day.
Wonderful, thank you for that. One last question, just because you touched on this earlier, Steve, the mental health component, that mental health resiliency that factors into this type of training. Are you able to share some examples from the ones that you've been provided? So how would you say mental health resiliency is looking for perhaps officers, trained in Iceland right now with something like IPREP?
I guess an example, I'll take it from a point of view of the officer themselves. So as an example, we were working with somebody that had suffered for many years with performance anxiety, getting through actual training. They know, any trainer that's listening right now will know the call-ins the day before, the people trying to come up with reasons not to attend, all those things. And that had a great strain on her, her capacity, her mental capacity. She had a lot of stress for weeks and weeks before training was even going to occur. All those stressors would come into place. So once she got through the IPREP program that we delivered, and we did a lot of work with this person, it was the best performance they'd ever done in training. And in fact, they actually said next year, and a comment that we heard was, next year I won't call in sick, So I think more than just a training piece, that getting you through the training, it really alleviated a lot of mental stress that was around the concept of training and that performance piece. And if you think about someone being at home for weeks before training is to occur and feeling the stress, that's affecting every piece of her life, for weeks before. And then if she's not happy with the way it went, she's going to have stressors after the fact and all those things that are going to go on. So I think one way that IPREP addresses the mental health from the officer's point of view, from the trainee's point of view, is that it relieves some of that stress and helps them focus in on what's needed, which is the training, and offset some of those stressors and mental health related things that can occur for people that have that anxiety about training.
And just to jump in, these are core physiological modulation techniques that work with stress if your teenager's yelling at you or your spouse or something. And so they work across situations, across occupational and family, responsibilities, duties, and so forth. So again, these are, if you learn these kind of core skills, they can be applied across the board.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. I think we have time for one last question to slip in there. This comes from a participant just now. He wonders, is there one form of monitoring? So I believe the biofeedback component that you referred to, is there one form that you would recommend over the others?
So for biofeedback equipment, there's a lot that's out there on the market right now. So it's really important that you investigate how they're getting the feedback, because some of the products right now have a delay in feeding you back your physiology. So 30 seconds to 2 minutes delay. So then if you're making adaptations to change your behavior, you're doing it on old data. So that's really important to have equipment, and this person could certainly email me. I can give you recommendations. We don't sell any particular equipment. So, but that kind of thing is really important, so that you're getting real-time feedback of true signals. Some of the other kind of fitness-based equipment also has a lot of error in the data that it's feeding you. So those are some things to think about and evaluate when you're choosing equipment to do this biofeedback training.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Judith. Okay, well, one final big thank you to our first two presenters, Stephen Poplawski and Judith Anderson. Thank you guys so much.